I'm joined today by Lowell Ponte, who is the former roving editor for Reader's Digest. He's also author of the new book, The Great Withdrawal: How the Progressives' 100-Year Debasement of America and the Dollar Ends. It's great to have you with us today. I want to talk about your recent editorial, Obamacare May Be Delayed and U.S. Debt Jumps $328 billion in One Day. I don't even know where to start because this piece is really chock full of interesting stuff. Let's start with debt and deficit. What is specifically your gripe with President Obama when it comes to debt and deficit?
Well, it's my gripe with progressives in general, and that is, ever since 1913, they have moved to a society in which we run by printing money. And when politicians of whatever party are given a chance to print money and to buy votes with it, they will do so, which I believe to be a destructive thing for the economy in the long run. We now, in fact, have accumulated so much debt, current and projected, that if we had to pay it off today, Dave, you would have to take dollar bills out of your wallet and make a stack of them that would reach from here to the planet Venus, 23 million miles away, and back, and you would still have enough dollars you'd need to pay to make 11 more stacks between Earth and the Moon.
Okay, but to pause there for a second, and rather than focusing on how many stacks of money we would need, let's focus on data and fact, because you said this is your problem with progressives and has been since the early 20th century. However, when we look at the data, and this is a statement which has been evaluated by the nonpartisan group PolitiFact and evaluated as true,
Actually, there's a great argument as to how nonpartisan PolitiFact really is, but go ahead.
Okay, well, let me get the argument out in any case. The deficit, not the total amount of that debt, the deficit has been falling at the fastest rate in 60 years under President Obama. You would have to go back 63 years to the period between 1946 and 1949 to find a bigger 4-year drop than what we saw between 2009 and 2012. So my question is, if your problem is with increasing of the deficit, your problem really should be with George W. Bush, not with President Obama.
Well, as a libertarian, I also do have a problem with George W. Bush and the Republicans.
Good.
I'm not saying this is a Republican or Democrat matter.
Well, but it is, because you just said
large government, and under President Obama, in fact, the share of government as a part of our gross domestic product has risen from about 19% when he took office to at its peak more than 25%. It's now around 23%.
Okay, so we need to be able
the economy by about 25% in 5 years.
But let's explore that, because your initial argument was that your problem with progressives is how they blow up the debt and deficit. I came back and I said, actually, President Obama has reduced the deficit, not increased it. And then you came back and said, well, it's not so much about Democrats and Republicans, but initially you said it was. Now you're redirecting. This is what's called an ad hoc rescue. You're redirecting and saying, actually, the problem is that President Obama has increased the share of the GDP that comes from the government. We're now no longer talking about the initial issue. These are very common redirection techniques.
Well, this is not intended as a technique. This is, if you ask why has the deficit temporarily come down, and by the way, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the deficit is going to, after this little dip, resume its stratospheric climb. We, by the year 2016, are going to be $20 trillion in debt.
But hold on, now we're talking about...
Things are being adjusted in part because last January, the Republicans agreed to $600 billion in additional taxes.
So what you're saying is that now you're going back and saying, initially you said it was partisan. Then when I pointed out that actually those numbers favor progressives, you said it's not partisan. And now you're actually saying it is partisan, but it's because of Republicans that the deficit has gone down, but it'll be back up really soon. Is that the argument if I follow it back and forth?
No, I think what you're trying to do is elicit a polarization here where there really isn't one.
No. I'm not trying to elicit a polarization at all. Okay, let's see if we can refocus in a different way, because I think that if the argument changes every time I present a fact, we're not going to get too far.
You keep arguing that what you're speaking of are facts, when in fact they are government massages of the data. But go ahead.
So why would the data only be massaged when President Obama is in office to be favorable to him, yet not when any other president? That doesn't really make sense. Hold on a second, Lowell. Lowell, you said you based your opinion that since 1913 progressives have been really bad for the debt and deficit, presumably on the same government data that you're now calling that has been massaged. So really, shouldn't we go back and say, actually, you can't even make that claim about progressives because you're basing it on the same data I'm using?
No, I can make that claim about progressives because progressives have been leaders, and they've certainly brought Republicans along with them.
Yeah.
Remember, by the way, the Republicans were the original progressive party here.
But again, Lowell, we're not talking about that. That doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. Let me put a pause here.
Does.
I don't think we're getting anywhere. Let's talk about the devaluing of currency.
I think you're trying to do a very narrow focus, and I'm trying to do a broader focus.
Let's broaden the focus. That's what I want to do. One of the other things that you talk about in your piece about the debt jumping.
By the way, what is this piece of mine? I don't remember writing such an article.
This is what your publicist sent me, and it has quotes from you and your co-author, Craig Smith.
But I didn't actually write that. But anyway,
so your publicist is pitching you with quotes that aren't yours?
Oh, they may be, but they're in the publicist's context.
Okay. Let me give you the following statement, which I've been told is from your new book. China has already downgraded the U.S. credit rating, and the talk on the street is Moody's and S&P may drop our credit rating from AAA to A-. This is a frightening prospect for a country that issues the world's reserve currency. I thought that as a libertarian, which you claim to be, you would want China to have less control over the U.S. economy. So wouldn't it be a positive thing if China were less interested in holding our debt such that they would sell it and have less control over the American economy? Wouldn't a libertarian welcome that?
We unfortunately live at a moment where America's number one export is its debt, is selling U.S. treasuries like that to China, Japan, and other nations. I would prefer that we were a country that had sound money, that did not rely on running on debt, as we do now. But we've set ourselves up in a position of having so many obligations and such a diminished productivity here that we apparently have to run the government by stretching out obligation that way.
Okay, so
then as a libertarian, you're right. I'm appalled by that.
Okay, but so then what is going to be the problem with China with the China downgrade of the U.S. debt? Isn't it just going to relieve us to some extent from Chinese ownership of American debt?
It's going to create a world in which the U.S., of course, is no longer the reserve currency, but this is something we've done to ourselves. China is simply recognizing that our dollar, which is no longer based in anything tangible, we have a faith-based currency now.
Correct.
We basically worldwide are losing faith in the dollar because our Fed, our government, is printing out of thin air $1 trillion a year. Now, there are some things Congress and the president cannot do. They cannot, for example, repeal the law of gravity. I wish they could. I mean, I wouldn't have to diet as much. But they can't. And likewise, they can't repeal the law of supply and demand. Dollars are just a commodity like potatoes when it comes down to it. And if the government out of thin air prints an extra trillion of them a year, then the value of the dollar relative to potatoes and other things falls. So it takes more dollars to buy things. That's the position we've put ourselves in. Meanwhile, we have an economy with only 101 million Americans who have full-time jobs, but we have 108 million Americans who are taking one or another means-tested welfare benefit.
Well, let's pause there.
49.2% of American households where somebody there gets a government check.
Let's pause there. I think you've opened up a topic for a much broader discussion. My counterpoint, and we will leave it at this, is that if your concerns are those jobs and American production, the devaluation of U.S. currency somewhat would increase tourism and it would increase exports from the US, which would provide many, many more jobs. But this is getting into more of a monetary policy, fiscal policy discussion, which unfortunately we don't have time for today, but I would love to have you back, Lowell Ponte. It would be a pleasure to have you back again.